Increasingly, outside funders, most famously the Koch brothers Foundation, etc., giving money to faculty members in ways that, with restrictions that require certain things to be taught, require certain research to be done, often where the donor actually gets to choose who is going to be hired to do the program. A third area of academic freedom is one I alluded to when I talked about freedom in the classroom, which is the growing threat of harassment on social media and even direct harassment of faculty members, either for comments they make in class or comments they make as citizens exercising their right to what we call extramural expression. And we have literally dozens of cases coming before us in the last few years where faculty members say something, it's then often distorted, but even if it isn't distorted, it's spread all over the internet, and suddenly the faculty members get threats. We have a case right now in Iowa. It's an interesting one, where a faculty member, some of his posts from Facebook from 2012, 7 years ago, were suddenly picked up by some right-wing websites, and suddenly he started getting all sorts of threats. The community college where he taught got all sorts of threats. And they said that, well, we support his academic freedom. He has the right to say this. But these threats are endangering our students, so we're going to fire him. Well, that sends a message to anybody. You want to get rid of a controversial faculty member, just start threatening violence against the campus, and they'll get rid of them. So, so these are the kind of threat, the major threat to academic freedom. But I would say that the single biggest threat to academic freedom today has been the deterioration of the tenure system. Some 25, 30 years ago or so, about 2/3 of those people who taught in American higher education were either tenured or on the path to getting tenure. Today, that number is less than a quarter. Increasingly, and the largest single group among teaching faculty are part-time adjuncts, often on term-to-term contracts. And the problem there is a tenured faculty member or even a faculty member probationary for tenure has to be dismissed. There actually has to be a procedure to say, well, we're gonna remove you. Person on a short-term contract, even if they've been teaching at the institution for 15, 20 years, and this fellow at Iowa had been teaching there for over 24 years, the last 9 consecutively, they don't have to be fired, they can simply be not renewed.
What I want to do is put some of what Hank has been talking about into context, into a sort of bigger context, both historically and in the contemporary moment of what I'm going to call the politicizing of knowledge in the United States. And some of what we've said might overlap a little bit, but probably not too much. And unlike Hank, I am a nervous talker, so most of what I have is written. I can't just do it off notes. Even when I taught, I always had to lecture. I couldn't just talk, which I think is not as good a way to sort of to talk to students, but you just have to listen to me read. And forgive me for my anxieties. So the notion of academic freedom in the United States comes from the early 20th century, the progressive era in the United States, when academic freedom is claimed for faculty because it was once believed that research and teaching by educators contributed to something that was thought of as the common good. And the common good meant the good of society as a whole. The free search for truth and its free exposition resulted in the knowledge upon which social, economic, political, and scientific progress depended. Academic freedom was meant not only to protect the continuous production of that knowledge by means of the unfettered, free research of faculty, but its transmission by teachers whose autonomy in the classroom was inviolate. The education of an intelligent and informed citizenry was taken to be the underpinning of democratic government. Progressives believed that an educated citizenry would offset the corrupting influence of powerful interest groups, thereby maintaining the health of the nation. So academic freedom rested on the assumption that knowledge and power were separable. The pursuit of truth ought to have nothing to do with public conflicts of interest, even if new knowledge might weigh in on one side or another of those heresies than not to think at all. Better that for them to climb new trails and stumble over error, if need be, than to ride forever in upholstered ease on the overcrowded highway. These were great sort of idealistic progressives at the turn of the 20th century. But academic freedom is not freedom in the ordinary sense. Indeed, in the sense which it's often invoked today as an individual right of anyone associated with an institution of higher education. Instead, as the legal scholar Adam Seitz puts it, free inquiry in academia is predicated on voluntarily assumed forms of unfreedom that are unique to the academy. The freedom to produce and transmit knowledge is limited by disciplinary norms that certify a scholar and/or a teacher's expertise, whose years of study have, again, to quote Seitz, turned one into someone whose desire is structured by the voluntary assumption of limits on the sayable and the thinkable, limits that entail distinctions of true and false. Seitz's examples are worth noting. And this is a long quote. The biologist is not free to speak as though evolution were not the decisive premise for the study of life on Earth. The climate scientist is not free to pretend that climate change is not human caused. The historian is not free to pretend that slave labor does not account for the genesis and basis of American culture, society, and politics. The poet or novelist who uniquely embodies the right to say anything is nevertheless unfree to stay silent when a poem or novel rings false. Knowledge is then the accumulated product of disciplined thought, verified by communities of scholars. It's of course what we take to be scientific fact, that vaccines prevent diseases, for example, or that the earth revolves around the sun, but it also refers to those areas that John Dewey said were bound up with the problems of life. These are the humanities and the social sciences, which offer interpretive, evidence-based readings of social structures, patterns of discrimination, art, and literature, as they exist and change over. It doesn't mean substituting opinion for knowledge. Rather, it involves learning to think within the limits that knowledge production requires. These limits do not mean that what counts as knowledge is forever fixed. The processes by which change occurs, often in the form of difficult contests between orthodoxy and innovation in our disciplines, are always subject to demanding communal standards, themselves open to challenge and change. The pursuit of truth, after all, is an endless and ever-evolving process. The standard of truth does not constrain the unfettered expression of individual opinion. That's a really, really important point. That right, the right of free speech, is defined as a private property belonging to an individual. In contrast, academic freedom is a corporate right that covers those who produce and transmit knowledge. One is about individual self-expression and no limits of truth or falsehood. The other is about collective contributions to the common good, where true and false matters, and the two are not the same. Yet recently, the distinction between academic freedom and free speech has become blurred. Administrators looking to promote civility on campus have offered the metaphor of the marketplace of ideas to encourage tolerance of diverse points of view both inside and outside the classroom. Although there are many different ways of pursuing truth, the marketplace is not one of them. Leaving the test of the validity of knowledge to the market abdicates academic responsibility and indeed subsumes what counts as knowledge to other tests of acceptability. And these days, those are especially political tests. Many of us have watched with horror as science has been politicized by the current administration. Donald Trump and his Republican enablers have cut funding for climate research, for the study of violence in relation to gun rights, and for stem cell research, as well as for the National Endowments for the Arts and Humanities. The AAUP has reported on the assault on science, as has the Union of Concerned Scientists. Both document what one journalist has called an all-out war on science, and what a committee at the New York University Brennan Center declares to be science at a crisis point. Facts matter not at all. What is at issue these days is the status of particular facts. We now have alternate facts competing with one another. But more broadly, the very status of knowledge and the location of its production and transmission, which is the university. Evidence of the politicizing of knowledge is abundant in relation to the university. It's what led Trump's Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos, to warn conservative students that, quote, the fight against the education establishment, that's us, extends to you too. The faculty, from adjunct professor to deans, tell you what to do, what to say, and more ominously, what to think. The truth claims of knowledge are here beside the point, as they are in the many Goldwater Institute model campus free speech acts being passed into law by state legislature after state legislature. These laws insist that professors present both sides of an issue in the classroom, for example, evolution and creationism, in order to protect the student right of free speech. Teachers can regulate speech, quote, provided they do so in a viewpoint and content-neutral manner. So you're teaching a course, if you're presenting the material and it has to be content-neutral, you can't present what it is you're qualified to teach. In effect, students are allowed to say anything they want, removing intellectual authority from the professor and removing the kind of teaching about how to think critically, removing that from the possibility of achieving it by the students. Cuts in funding have led to greater need for private support, and this goes back to some of the attacks or dangers to academic freedom Hank was talking about, accompanied by increased intervention in academic decision-making by wealthy donors, to the substitution of contingent employees who cost less for more expensive permanent tenured faculty, to a widening gap between richer and poorer institutions, one that parallels the widening gap between the rich and the poor and the population at large, to the introduction of corporate management styles by academic administrators and boards of trustees, and a constant diminution of faculty participation in university governance, and to the substitution by university administrators of calculations of risk and quantitative measures of output for evaluations of the quality of ideas. At some universities and colleges, algorithms are now used to judge candidates for tenure, measuring the number of books, the number of pages in the books, and the number of articles produced, rather than the quality of their contents. These corporate management styles have spawned an assessment movement to measure the impact of research and teaching in entirely quantitative terms. Most universities in the United States now have offices of academic assessment, I don't know if you guys have one, with teams of experts, very few of them academics, who collect data and are available to help faculty develop appropriate strategic plans, especially for teaching. A National Association of Assessment Professionals coordinates and standardizes these activities. At the University of Southern Maine, to take only one example, assessment officials refer to a culture of evidence according to which learning outcomes are judged so that programmatic adjustments may be made most effectively. This is also accompanied by a change in the definition of students. Students are now referred to as clients or customers of the university rather than as students who come for an education. There are all sorts of figures we could cite on the decline in funding for all of these things, but because I think we should have a discussion about some of this, I just want to say all the noise about free speech on campus works to silence critics of these large structural developments and to take our attention away from them. It's one more weapon in the campaign to erode public faith in the mission of higher education. There are other weapons as well. Those who have tied increased tuition and student debt to mismanagement and fraud, to the notion that universities are responsible for social inequality, and to the representation of faculty as elitist, sheltered from public accountability by the dubious claim of academic freedom. Another more insidious eroding of the image of higher education, indeed of education in general, is Trump's celebration of mediocrity, if not of know-nothingness, as a national virtue, embodied in the appointment of cabinet secretaries, judges, and heads of agencies who know nothing about the work for which they are presumed to be responsible. The degradation of the very notion of expertise and the knowledge upon which it is based has everything to do with the abandonment of the idea of the common good. And I sort of want to present that as a kind of horrifying picture. It's not without its critics, it's not without its resistance. Indeed, there's a whole sort of movement, I think, of people who are looking again to articulate something of the notion of a common good. And I think we have to be among them as faculty, as students, wanting to think outside of the box of individual responsibility, individual rights, not that individual rights aren't important, but to think in terms of what's good for the society as a whole, what's good for us as a collectivity, as a commonwealth. And in the academy, we need academic freedom to protect the space within which those criticisms can come forward. But the survival of the concept and practice of academic freedom depends on our ability to come up with some way of thinking the common good. So they're doubly connected. The common good will not survive, and for that matter, neither will individuals or the planet survive, without medical knowledge, knowledge of climate change, knowledge of history, knowledge of how structures of discrimination work at the economic, social, political, and psychic levels to perpetuate inequalities of race, gender, sex, and religion. It's academic freedom that protects the production and dissemination of that knowledge. It's that knowledge that nourishes and advances the common good. The future of the common good and of academic freedom are bound up together. One of them cannot survive with the other. It's up to us to ensure their joint survival. And I hope we can talk about how to do that. Thank you.